Hi, today this is Jason Campbell covering the Pantone The Inside Scoop presentation that was delivered at this year's Color 20 Color Conference in San Diego, California. The content of this presentation is a bit of a background on Pantone and some insights. A lot of people always ask us a lot of questions about things like the fan decks, different challenges, best practices, and we figured that we would put this together and have a nice presentation, which a number of attendees visited us at the conference. And for those that didn't, here you are today. That said, again, my name's Jason Campbell. I'm a solution architect with X-Rite Pantone. I've got 20 years or so in the printing industry. Quite a bit of a broad background between computer science, color management. Makes me a bit of a nerd, but one that takes color seriously and hoping to help clear up some of the mysteries around Pantone, something we've all come to rely on in our respective positions within the industry. So that said, what are we covering today? We're going to go over the Pantone Guides, some common challenges, things that a lot of times we get emails and calls about. Managing expectations, that's a really big one, certainly one that comes into play very heavily in my role and my colleagues' roles as solution architects working with customers. Best practices, things you can do to try to make sure that you set yourself up for success. Some frequently asked questions, again, things that we hear about a lot, see if we can help head some of those off and give you some clarity. And a little Q&A, which since this is a on-demand recording, I might just add in some things that came up from the conference and add that into here to this recording. So let's start off with a little history. Everybody always has asked me different tidbits about Pantone. I think everybody finds it interesting to hear about where a company starts, or especially something as ubiquitous as Pantone. Where did it start? How did it start? How did it come to be? So in the beginning, what's interesting is Pantone wasn't Pantone. Pantone was a commercial printer. They had a big focus in the cosmetics industry, and this was back in the 1950s. So printing was certainly a very different animal than it is today. About mid 1956, a gentleman by the name of Lawrence Herbert was hired at Pantone. He had come in really just to come work at the print shop. And as he had picked up and learned more about the business, he realized that they had a lot of challenges around these color cards that they were producing to control and communicate the color of the cosmetics for the customers that they were servicing. And as you could imagine, that sounds an awful lot like what we know as the concept around what Pantone is. And indeed, this was so successful that by 1962, Lawrence Herbert raised funds and bought out the print company and rebadged it Pantone. 1963, the Pantone matching system, as we more or less know it today, was introduced. And rapidly after that, additional products such as the process guide, tint selector, and a number of other products started to come into being. Throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, really till modern day, Pantone has become synonymous with color communication and is the leader in color standards, especially in the print industry, and certainly across other segments such as fashion, home, interiors, plastics, and so forth. Two other pivot points in the company's history is 2007, X-Rite acquired Pantone. And then in 2012, X-Rite itself was acquired by Danaher, where we all are part of the PID group, or Product Identification Group. This is a picture of some old fan decks that comes from my own personal little collection. People always find it interesting when they say, you know, how old's your fan deck? And somebody says, oh, I've got one from a couple of years ago. And I said, well, I think I could do better. So in the upper top there, One of the fun ones that I like to bring out is a 1973 edition, which predates myself. And then, of course, I've got a 1981 there, and some of these come from different points in time. But one of the interesting things to really take away from this little show and tell is the breadth of the products that Pantone has made over the years, some of which have certainly come and gone as different industry trends have come and gone. Really shows the breadth and attention Pantone pays to service the industry and try to create color communication products to help whatever that current state may be. So at the bottom, you see there's color with black, and that was very common before process print came to be. Duotones were very, very commonplace earlier in especially the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And then as process print came along, that really sort of found its way out. Off on the right, you've got a Pantone deck printed on craft board. So what we would call a modern day example of almost a Pantone live dependent standard, which we'll get into a little later, is right there, is what do these colors look like on something other than the normal bright white stock that we print. So let's get into it. How do we make these things? This is probably the #1 question that we get asked, and everybody's always, when they come for tours, they want to see the magic press. Well, it's not that magic, but it's certainly quite unique. They are, what I think most people know, are printed offset. So we have paste inks, but it's a waterless press. We do have a standard unit on the printing press that prints the black copy that we all see underneath each of the color bars, where you see things like the formula or the color name and so forth, or the page number. And that's a standard unit. But when it gets to the unit that lays down the Pantone colors, that's where things get really unique. This is a custom built, one-of-a-kind segmented unit that has 28 individual ink zones. And while 28 ink zones isn't unique, it is certainly unique when it represents essentially 28 individual ink trains. So that means a segmented fountain, 28 different wells, 28 split rollers. And as you see from the picture here, that's communicated all the way down to the press sheet coming through, where there is a division between each zone as an individual color. And that's how we get the application of ink straight across as a full bar across the press sheet. Another big question is, what are the biggest challenges you guys face doing this? We've done it for a lot of years, as I shared in the history, and you'd think that, hey, maybe there's a magic way around, the immediate challenges that might pop into mind, and unfortunately, there's not. It really is a tour de force every time that we go to press, and the biggest challenge, honestly, is the number of colors. Anybody that's been around Pantone or using the Pantone system for any length of time realizes that they have not been the same colors since 1968. They have changed over time. They've added up. There's been more and more. And as of our latest printing, our latest edition in September 2019, across both the coated guide, the metallics, the pastels, the neons, we're at about 3,026 colors. So what you see in this picture here are some of those cans of those colors, and each one is blended by hand. Now, sometimes people ask, isn't there another way you could do this? Or, I've seen people make paint at the store, and isn't it quicker? But unfortunately, the reality is that each of these is a dynamic formula that needs to be maintained and hand assembled by a colorist and go through a QA process before it's put in the can, before it's ever sent to press. And while this looks like a lot on these shelves, there are several more units just like them outside the frame. So you can imagine the daunting task it is to go ahead and mix each of these colors, and every one of these cans is consumed throughout the production that we go through for each run of a fan deck. When it comes down to printing on press, of course, we're keeping an eye on things. So we have a target that we aim for, and that is less than 2.0 delta E to the digital data. The digital data obviously doesn't yellow, it doesn't fade, it doesn't degrade over time. Those are our masters. Those are what we have held ourselves to, which are the actual spectral targets that represent what we call the color DNA of the Pantone identities. So that guides us during that blending process, and of course guides us for the QC process on press. And here you can see the results of that unique printing press laying down stripes across the entire sheet. And then of course we still do visual checks just to make sure we have a good correlation between what we have been running throughout the press run, as well as the numbers that we're getting on press. We're always striving to improve the process. So as some of you have heard from other communications from the company, we're making great strides to improve our quality, but it is a never-ending cycle to focus on wherever we can do better. And there are active projects right now that while we've made good strides over the last 12 to 18 months, there's even more to come. So that brings up another good one, which is, what are the guides? What are they good for? You know, people, there's a lot of attitudes. There's a lot of, you know, when I delivered this at the conference, you could hear the little undercurrent throughout the 50 to 60 attendees in the room. And this was a really interesting one. So what are they? Well, they are useful in design for color inspiration. We know in the design part of the business, it is an indispensable tool to go through and find something that meets the needs of a design for a designer, a brand manager, somebody, you know, in marketing looking for inspiration to find a color that goes along with their messaging. They're a terrific quick reference for color visualization. You know, if I say, what is Pantone 2273? That doesn't really tell you what it is. So obviously for those of us on the production side, whether you're on the ink side, the printing side, the pre-press side, the fulfillment side, it's a terrific reference to look up what is that color. And of course, the reason that it's such a terrific tool for all of these things is that it is a globally recognized tool for color communication. No matter where you are, anybody in the business recognizes the name Pantone, and that is an immensely helpful thing when you're trying to communicate a brand image or a design across regions or across the globe. But now here's the big one. What aren't they? They are not the reference target of a color. Now, this can be met with a little bit of controversy depending who you're talking to or how you want to look at this. But the fact remains that when we make the guides, those are printed incarnations of that digital data. And regardless of how hard we strive to make that the best representation we can deliver to our customers and our users of the product, they are not a delta E of 0 to the reference data. There will always be variation to any printed incarnation of a digital target. This is just the reality. Whether it's inkjet proofing, digital printing, screen printing, offset printing, flexo printing, it is just the reality. And they are also not perfect to each other. Now, this is one area I can say for certain that there has been great improvement, is the consistency from guide to guide. I think those that have used the product over the years can probably mutter under their breath that they've had experienced frustrations in that realm. And we see and we hear back from people all the time that they have seen and felt the improvements made there, where from book to book within a run, that the variant has been shrunk down significantly. so that each of our production runs is very uniform to each other. And to reiterate, the measurements from guides are not standards. So I've seen it. I've worked with customers where they take their fan deck and they measure that fan deck. That is not the best way to go. That is certainly not what we convey as the reference, but we'll get into that a little bit more as we go on here. Some other challenges. So a big challenge that we face, and I know that those that are listening to this from our ink production environment or ink blending environment will probably be smiling as they look at this slide. Yeah, when you have a color that is 98.5% transparent white and 1.5% pigment, a breath in either direction will make that color exhibit a variation. And then that commutes as we try to get on the press and match a color standard where we're trying to match these pastels and neutrals, which are super notorious for this issue, where any little variation will manifest itself in not only a measurable difference, but certainly a visual difference, both of which are guiding principles in our expectations of quality production. I always like to say, as I give this out, I go, it's a drop of color in an ocean of trans white. And you see the picture right here, and there are a number of colors that are just like it. The cool grays, the warm grays, certainly those that are all, you know, from about cool and warm gray 5 and under, really are a majority of trans white. Pastels, again, those that have been around this certainly will recognize this issue. And another challenge that we face is that trans white has a tendency over time to yellow. And so therefore we have to compensate and try to attack that shift as well, because you don't have a richer pigment to defend against that, where trans white is only, say, 50% of the formula. Another challenge is that the substrate for Pantone Guides does contain OBA. That has been a long-standing trend and one that for now remains consistent. Both the coated and uncoated guides do have an appreciable level of OBA in them. For those not familiar with the term, that means an optical brightening agent. So these are things that make the paper appear whiter and brighter. And the reason for that is that is not an uncommon trend in paper products out in the marketplace, as brand managers, marketing departments are all looking to make their colors and their messaging jump off the page. There's always a balance between color selection, substrate selection, and presentation of that final printed product. So what you see on the left of this slide is a straight measurement of the substrate where you can see what we refer to as an OBA bump. This is where UV energy has been placed onto the substrate and is re-emitted back into the measurement instrument in roughly the 440 to 460 nanometer range. So when we see a bump like that, we know that OBA is present. Now, why is this important to Pantone? Well, back to this prior slide, we see that there's colors that have a tremendous amount of transparent white versus a tremendous amount of pigment. So for a dark color, that masks out a tremendous amount of that substrate. Not a lot of light penetrates through that heavy ink film, and therefore very little UV energy is either absorbed, and certainly even less is re-emitted. So you don't see that bump. That's why it's flat in the picture on the top right. Whereas a light color, which is predominantly transparent, you see that while that it's attenuated, it's not nearly as prominent as the raw substrate. It still creates a challenge to get and maintain a good match. So that is something to keep in mind when evaluating these colors. So another big one, and probably the biggest that we emphasize on the X-Rite side of the business, is managing expectations and achieving consistency. That's a really important word, is consistency, because accuracy is certainly tremendously critical. But in many times, we find that the consistency is at an equal and occasionally even seen as a more important trait than the accuracy itself. And that's because when something is put on shelf or a mailing or a magazine or a print or a box or a package, having a stable public customer facing appearance is more critical than whether or not that color was a 0.8 or a 1.8 delta E. So what do we mean by that? Well, the big thing is when we get out and we specify color, we might communicate that physically or digitally. When we do that physically, and this gets back to why necessarily, looking at my fan deck versus your fan deck, and I'm going to match, and then I'm going to match your match, it's really making a copy of a copy. So if you think of that kind of old sort of metaphor of the copy of the copier, I'd be dating myself if I say, faxing, making a copy of a fax, you can get the picture that the quality degrades as those copies and iterations are made. So I might start with my physical standard, and I give that in this illustration. Let's say the first copy is given to printer number 1 in his ink department and printer number 2 in her ink department, and they go off and they take their best stabs at it, and they do great. They do a terrific job. Ink professionals, they do an amazing job getting their matches, and we have a sub 1.0 delta E. That's terrific. Now we send that on out. We now go ahead and send that out to the print platform. Let's just assume they're all the same print platform, same everything. So really all we're differing here is the mechanism to communicate the color. So now what I have is my iteration and my match to the iteration, and now my print variation, which typically can be, say 2 to 3 delta E on press, depending on how strict we're being. But I'd say that's about nominal for the industry these days. So all along, I feel I've done very well. My book to your book is pretty close, and my match to my book is pretty close, and my press run is pretty close to my ink match is pretty close. So I've gone on and done really well, and so did the other person. But when we compare the two products on shelf, we realize that now we've actually, because we've gone to sort of two different directions, actually have a tremendous delta E between us. And that manifests itself as something very inconsistent. So a term we often use is error stacking. It's a physical to an iteration of a physical to what amounts to be another physical, a drawdown, if you will. And then a standard being cast from that, and then managing that on press. And from supplier to supplier, you can imagine now that from a brand perspective, this has led to quite a bit of on-shelf variation. So how do we manage it? How do we attack that? So a strategy is what Pantone has created is what we refer to as Pantone Live. Now, this is a set of dependent standards as well as master standards. And what we mean by the masters is very much the color DNA that I referred to earlier that guides our own production. These are the spectral targets that we follow to produce our own work, but then have taken those and have spun them off into other variations for other different print processes to create achievable targets under different ink systems and different print processes. But even as the masters alone, now if you create a central point of truth, I'm no longer passing copies to copies to copies. I have my ink department matching the master digital. I have my QC on press matching the master digital. And that's what the other facilities and other suppliers are doing as well. So between proofs, ink labs, matching, and production, we now suddenly drive that variation down, and you can see here we've eliminated the error stack and have a much more consistent methodology to achieve those targets. So a single point of truth and a digital target is absolutely a best practice in terms of minimizing that variability and getting a much more repeatable methodology in place. That said, of course, we don't want to just turn our backs on visual where this sounds like just measure everything and that's that. We certainly have to still use visual, but we use that as a sanity check instead of trying to use that as our primary QC methodology. A pragmatic approach is to use measurement to quantify and visual to verify. So more on the difference between a master and a dependent with this example here. We all know that, as we already covered, we print the Pantone masters in the formula guide with paste inks on an offset litho press, but these are not how all Pantone colors are produced. In this example, this is water-based Flexo on brown craft, and you can see that getting the same match is all but impossible because the substrate white point is significantly different. We're in a completely different print process in Flexo with a tremendously different ink system being fluid-based, water-based Flexo versus paste offset litho. And so what we do with these dependent standards is to create an achievable target which is defined as something with globally accessible and generally available pigments that are a nominal condition for those in the industry of water-based Flexo, represented relatively from the substrate that dependent library is defined for, so that now it's not to match the original color, because in many cases you just simply can't. But the key, again, as stated prior, in many cases is consistency is more critical than necessarily making the ideal match, which in many cases can't be achieved. So by creating an achievable target, we now have a digital target defined that's achievable in that ink system and that substrate and print process, that now when you go to that central point of truth, we can drive the variability away, because instead of me trying to get my best match to the master and somebody else taking their best shot at it, we now both have the same commonly defined achievable target, so that while we know that we're going to miss, we miss the same way and deliver consistency. Some more examples on this comes from another tool within the Pantone Live ecosystem, which is Pantone Live Visualizer. This is a digital emulation of those digital standards, because again, we don't have a fan deck, we don't have a Pantone guide for each of these, currently, I believe 36 different palettes. So how do we see those? How do we see how far off that my color? In this example, 7466, let's assume that's my brand identity color and equity color for me, but I know I'm going to be printing on folding carton, I'm going to have an outside container box, and I want to use my brand equity color on all of these different substrates and production processes. I can now assess how much variability could I expect to see that. And while, maybe on my on-shelf product and folding carton, I have a very low delta E, I see very good achievability. I expect I'm going to have the label on my product and its containing box and product packaging to have a good match. I can see once I start getting into my overboxing, I'm going to start having a challenge. And that may or may not present an issue to your design. And therefore, this is a very effective design tool to start managing that expectation up front with how achievable is your color on these processes, and Pantone Live is a very effective way to do this. Another example is because we don't have these fan decks in all of these different flavors, we can also print a digital rendition of this in what we refer to as the Pantone simulator. These are digitally produced. They emulate all of the color specifications from those digital targets and give you a way to communicate those throughout the design process so that those expectations can be further managed. And as stated before, it's not that these printed renditions are the standard, but they are now a physical manifestation to assist the color communication process. Another one with respect to achievability is, of course, probably one of the longest known issues is converting from spot color to process print. So when we look at the fan deck and we look at the formula guide, this is really the genesis of all things Pantone for the graphics product line, meaning for the print and packaging industry. So when we look at these identities, these are formulated colors. It's why it's called the formula guide. You see in this illustration an indication of what that formulation is. We see that trans white content with the amount of pigment that results in that color. But not all of these colors translate well when you go to the world of process printing. Enter the color bridge. This is another product that's represented as a lithographically, offset print product with the same paper as our formula guide. And the formula on the left, so you have a very close alignment between the formula guide, because essentially that's its rendition on the left side of the page, and then a conversion to process print or four color print on the right-hand side. In this example, many of these colors for this illustration do make a fairly faithful transition. But as you can imagine, anybody that's had experience with this or is familiar with the Color Bridge product has no doubt flipped through it and found some very saturated and bright orange or greens or other different shades of purples don't translate very well at all. Even some would say close at all in four color print because you just can't get there. And that achievability is something that the Color Bridge helps you identify. So if this is your color, these blues work quite nicely. If a bright orange is your color, that might not translate so well. There's also the concept of process print as four color versus, not so much the new kid on the block, but certainly one that's growing in adoption, which is 7-color or ECG printing, expanded gamut. Expanded gamut introduces the concept of orange, green, and violet to the process print. So we're still looking to try to use only, 3 primary colorants in the builds that represent the color in the process environment, but we now can select from orange, green, and violet pigments in that process makeup to reach out to some of those colors that had been a challenge in pure 4-color CMYK process print. And when we make that move, we see a terrific achievement of getting to those colors that had been a challenge in the past. We have a product, the XGC guide or expanded gamut guide, that helps communicate very much what the achievability is when converting the formula guide colors to 7-color. And what you see on screen here is really the trifecta of the toolkit to manage through these decision processes, whether it be a formulated spot, a 4-color conversion, or a 7-color conversion. For those that are familiar with the product, and for everybody else listening to this presentation, what you might not be aware is that in 2019, we made an update to the color bridge. This was part of the updated print process for the color bridge product, which was to realign it to the G7 calibration methodology. This is a process that is been, I would say, over the last 15 years, growing in popularity, not only in North America, but globally, as a guideline for managing the process print environment. The general concept behind it is to create a universal or relative appearance model so that a print on one type of substrate with a process can be visually in line and appealing and congruous with another one. And so really that's been a big adoption for when you think of outside just a specific, color flood fill somewhere, a big solid area of color, you have imagery and product photography and other logos and designs that are part of a print package. And therefore G7 has really helped that process throughout the industry. So with that, we've adopted that in our 4-color makeup, and also the 7-color makeup, while not featured in this slide, as the method that we built those builds and manage that conversion to show what the 4-color rendition of a color is. And so the idea behind that is now we have given a much more achievable and a clear communication of what to expect when making that conversion. So in the past, one of the big things that we've gotten as feedback within the Pantone universe is, I don't understand what the right numbers are. I see my Adobe software says one thing, the color bridge says something else. I clicked some buttons, I got different numbers. And there was a lot of not very clear communication of where those numbers came from or why those numbers were those numbers. And in the past, throughout the history of the color bridge for probably the last 9 to 10 years, they had really all reflected manually adjusted values, where as Pantone, we tried to tweak those builds to get sort of the best match. And while some might say that's great, the only problem with that when you put that into practical terms is that really ends up only matching our print process with our profiles on our substrate with our press and our calibration, and therefore it doesn't really align with what your expectation or your process is. By realigning this to an industry guideline, now this is something that's a lot more transparent and a lot less ambiguous, so that now I can achieve those numbers in my design tools and I do understand where they came from. And while they may still differ, and the ability to make that 4-color transition and match may vary based on the nuances of your proofing or print process, our rendition within the color bridge tool is at least now on an industry-wide, less ambiguous platform, and therefore is a better representation of where commercial print is in this day and age, and gives you a better expectation as to what that transition is going to look like. You see an example here. We have the legacy guide where things have converted and we have numbers that don't necessarily match up to what was printed in the book. In our old guide, you see the numbers are different. And in the new guide, they've changed because, again, with the alignment to where the CRPC 6 for coded, again, an industry published data set for offset litho print on a coded stock, and CRPC 3 for uncoded, is now something that lets us do these conversions in a more faithful way, and in many cases get an actual better match than we had in the past. Further, and worth pointing out, is that your color settings in the Adobe products do matter. And while that's not the focus of this presentation, it is something to highlight that over time that process has changed. And so depending on the configuration of your software, your results to match this example on screen may vary. We'll probably be covering more of that as we develop more content to share with you to provide better insights and guidance on that topic. But it is something to highlight here that if you go click and try to follow along, you might not see the same numbers, but just understand it's a matter that if you have your Adobe software configured in your color settings to use something other than CRPC 6 for a coded color, your number conversion may be different. Another very critical one to highlight, but not get too deep in today, is that for design applications, the majority of the color data supplied to licensees to put into products like RIPs, design software, Creative Suite, and so forth, tends to be M2. That means UV cut, and therefore is different than what we have going on in production, which typically is M0. And that's an important consideration when we're trying to see and compare these conversions. You might see a difference when comparing one data set to another. And while that's a little out of scope for today's discussion, it's very critical to come away understanding that in the design phase, it is certainly advantageous to continue to communicate a spot color as a named spot color and do your proofing and go ahead and work with that as a named color. And then that commutes to the production side where it's a named color. But if I was to compare the two final bits of data, I might see a delta E between them. I in fact guarantee you'll see a difference. However, that's a fact of just legacy in nature that the design tools is M2, UV cut, and production is M0. Further, don't always expect a perfect match if you were to just go typing in the RGB or CMYK values from the guide, because depending on your color workflow and the production pipeline from design to fulfillment and production, that process may have nuances that don't align to that G7 CRPC 6 or CRPC 3 or sRGB color space. And therefore, if you go ahead and make that conversion, you've already made decisions that aren't leveraging the best practice for your print process. Because that process is settings and process dependent, you will get the best results by communicating a spot color throughout your workflow as the spot color and make the conversions in the appropriate steps where required. And at the beginning and throughout the workflow is that digital targets are a must. It is the most cohesive way to create a stable color workflow. And to reiterate, do not measure a guide and use that as the standard, or you will scratch your head when you start to realize that it doesn't match the data in your RIP or your design tool or the color data within your QC tools, because you've now taken a snapshot in time from your snapshot of a snapshot versus using the central point of truth and something such as either licensed Pantone data from a vendor or from Pantone Live. Another one is, but my design app doesn't have that color to begin with. So we've spent all this time talking about it, but now I don't even have that color. So here we have an example where on the one side, I have what I had in my Illustrator, and yet in Pantone Live Visualizer, I see this 4000 series. Well, this is part of the 294 new colors that were introduced in September of 2019. The fact of the matter is that licensees get a set of data from Pantone as part of their process to introduce Pantone color identities within their product. And that is not always completely aligned with the schedule of color releases from Pantone itself. So a way to mitigate that is by use of either the Adobe Connect Pantone plugin, which is available on the Adobe Exchange for Creative Suite, or Pantone Color Manager, which I think has been around for a number of years. Many people are familiar with it. And those are two strategies to get access to those colors before the software vendor or the RIP vendor updates their software on their time frame to include those new identities. And probably another big one that's I hear probably more than anything is, well, when are you going to stop changing the colors? Well, I can't speak for the distant past, but as of 2010, these digital standards that we communicate to licensees and throughout the Pantone Live tool chain and ecosystem have been locked down. That digital data does not change. That is the color DNA. That will not move. A 180C is a 180C from here on out. I can't talk about what might have happened 15 or 20 years ago. What I have heard and seen, and I believe some of sort of the tribal knowledge that's been passed on, which is back, in the day, so to speak, that the digital data that was ever published would try to follow the editions of the Pantone Guides. We realized that was sort of chasing our own tail. And so at 2010, the decision was made to lock that down and create a stable color identity so that we would no longer have people going, well, what 180C is that? Was that from 2005 or 2010 or so forth? But again, remember that mention about M conditions. Anything around the design side is going to be M2 UV cut data. And so one of the things we see on the X-Rite side a lot when we work with customers on the production side is we find that their Pantone data did not come from Pantone Live or from a production tool, but came from the design side. And so now they're trying to match data that doesn't necessarily jive with the production side, which is typically an M0. So probably a pitfall to be aware of if you're communicating digital targets from the design tools into production. So best practices is certainly to keep your guide, in good shape. It is a tool. It is a tool to assess everything we've talked about, whether it's color identity, conversion to process. But over time, we've added colors. And if you've got a dated version of your fan deck, it's something to be aware of. So since 2010, we've added 826 colors cumulatively over different editions that have come out in 2012, 14, 16, and again last year in September of 2019. And at this point, we now have 2,161 colors in that book. So if you have a book from as recent as even just 2018, you're missing those color identities. And as time goes on, that book is aging. It is a best practice to keep that book fresh so that you have the best rendition possible and also leverage any of the production benefits and improvements that we make at Pantone to make those books the best books we can make. A reason when somebody says, well, you just want to sell more books, that's why you tell us to get rid of them every year or two. Well, this is a real picture from a real book taken from production. You can see that paper yellowed. You see the marks, you see the wear on it. these are tools. They're expected to be used. They get banged up, they get dirty. Ink rooms, the picture below is a real living ink room. It's reality. This is not a clean room business. This is a production business. And to keep that tool at peak performance is to keep that tool in top shape. And every 16, 18 months is really our best guidance. I think our official statement is 12 to 18, but I think that that goes without saying, especially in a high usage environment. And certainly to keep that out of heat, UV, high humidity, and so forth goes without saying. A little known tool on the back of every fan deck is the D50 lighting indicator. The colors are matched and managed in D52 degree. That means there is a standard viewing condition defined, and this tool at the back of each book is there to help you assess, am I in that condition? I think most people in the business have probably run across but it looked good in my office, but it didn't look good in so-and-so's office or down on the shop floor or in the store. These are all different lighting conditions. So if you're doing color critical color matching, it's really highly advised to take advantage of this tool. Make sure that you're pulling it out from the back of the book and seeing that both of those blocks match, because that's your indicator that you're in appropriate lighting. We also sell them as separate units that can be purchased for use or put in a booth or put in different environments where you have meetings or do make design decisions, so that you can make sure that the lighting is appropriate to make good, stable, informed decisions. So what do we do with all this? That was quite a bit. And if you've made it this far, I commend you. But the biggest piece of advice out of all of this is think of your color workflow. Don't take it for granted. Think through it. Think where there are the gaps. Are there any gaps that align to the content of this presentation today? Do you have a question? Are you confident of how color standards are being managed and where conversions are possibly being made between different sets of data, or making changes to RGB or CMYK if designing for the web or designing for process print? Physical standards have an absolute purpose in the process. They are absolutely tremendously effective for inspiration, and they are great for communication as well. However, digital standards provide unparalleled accuracy because they don't age, they don't degrade. And to make sure is spectral targets, because while this is not a deeply technical review, a spectral target allows us to make sure that we're getting the best match when formulating or converting a color, so that we can get the best appearance and the most stable and uniform appearance as we produce and reproduce that color throughout the workflow and different processes. It's also important to recognize not all colors are achievable all the time on all things, by all print processes, on all substrates, by all ink systems. And that is a challenge I think we all have run into. And that is an important piece to just understand, that that is a fact. There is no willing somebody to make a Pantone 100C yellow look like Pantone 100C yellow in a fan deck on a brown craft cardboard box printed with water-based Flexo. So manage your expectations and set realistic tolerances and work with your supplier. Communication is absolutely critical, and Pantone products help in that communication process. Pantone Live helps in the digital communication process. Instrumentation is key to make sure you quantify the consistency of the process, and of course, evaluating and proper lighting and proper conditions helps our visual assessment double check and validate that process. So with all of that, thank you. Thank you for making it through this rather comprehensive run through of material today. I hope it was, informational. I hope it was informative. Thank you for attending and giving us your time. And if any questions or feedback or other interests come from your time with this material, please feel free to reach out to us at printmarketing_NA@xrite.com, and we'll look to address that in future content material coming soon to a webinar near you.